The history of sea power is largely, though by no means solely, a narrative of contests between nations, of mutual rivalries, of violence frequently culminating in war. The profound influence of sea commerce upon the wealth and strength of countries was clearly seen long before the true principles which governed its growth and prosperity were detected. To secure to one's own people a disproportionate share of such benefits, every effort was made to exclude others, either by the peaceful legislative methods of monopoly or prohibitory regulations, or when those failed, by direct violence. So begins the pages of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a history of naval warfare published in 1890 by Alfred Thayer Mann. Such was the impact of this book that it is widely credited with sparking the naval arms race between the United Kingdom and Imperial Germany, transforming the doctrine of the Japanese Navy, and spurring the United States to become a great power across the Pacific and the world. The core of Mann's argument is relatively simple, and familiar to anyone who has studied the UNSC's struggle against the Covenant, the Dominion War, or the Clone Wars. A great navy is essential for national prosperity. To expand into new markets, you need to look overseas. To protect access to those markets and deter foreign rivals, you need a powerful fleet. While Mahan could not predict every development in naval warfare, what was true in the late 19th century holds true in the 21st, and will likely still hold true in the 24th century and beyond. The success of any great power, not bound to a single planet but instead spread across multiple star systems, will depend on its ability to maintain its access to those planets and develop its relationships with any foreign interstellar nations, deterring foreign aggression if necessary. So if we agree that an interstellar navy is critical to any spacefaring civilization, what kinds of ships should it include? How should it be organized? What doctrine should it follow? These are the questions we'll be discussing on this episode of Incoming. And buckle up, folks, grab some stroganoff and vanilla Coke, because this is a long one. But before we begin, it's important to note that space seems to work quite a bit differently depending on which alternate reality you find yourself in. Sometimes space seems a lot like the one we know and love. There's gravity, and you need to worry about annoying things like physics and mass. Other times, space is kinda like an ocean. There's an up and a down, and everyone just seems to know which is which. Spacecraft can fly wherever they like, and it's no big deal. Sometimes space really is an ocean. There's treasure galleons and pirates, and you need to memorize your points of sail, so you don't luff your space spinnaker when your ship is tacking against solar winds. With that in mind, this guide might not be relevant to every interstellar navy, but hopefully this can be at least something of a starting point. And the most interesting place to start, it seems to me, is ship type. Now, this usually refers to a ship's size and intended use, and should not be confused with a ship's class. For example, in the case of a Constitution-class heavy cruiser would be the ship type, and Constitution the ship's class. Now, while most interstellar navies across alternate worlds have adopted maritime terminology in describing their various ship types, these designations are always evolving. Even on our own world, destroyers and cruisers used in the 19th century are very different from destroyers and cruisers in the 21st century, and their transition into interstellar use would certainly bring about even greater changes. There can even be a bit of overlap between ship classes, and they're not always mutually exclusive. With that in mind, when discussing ship types, these should always be considered more starting points, and not rigid constraints on warship design. We'll be starting with the smallest ship types, FACs, Corvettes, Frigates, all the way up to battleships and aircraft carriers, and then close with some more unusual types. Okay, so FACs, patrol boats, patrol craft, patrol vessels, whatever you call them, whatever is being patrolled, these are generally the smallest ships you'll see in any navy, but they might also operate in a nation's coast guard, police force, or even customs office. These aren't typically designed to engage in any warships, but rather, as the name suggests, patrol their area of responsibility and undertake various border protection roles. You'd find ships like this involved in anti-smuggling, anti-piracy, and immigration law enforcement. They might also be called upon to participate in rescue operations. In an interstellar navy, I would expect ships like these to operate from terrestrial or orbital facilities and rarely be included in any major battle fleet. They might not even be equipped with whatever technology allows for travel between star systems, and instead be confined to either a planet's orbit or its star system. In wartime, they likely wouldn't be used in any direct battles, but instead intended to defend important stations or maybe ambush larger vessels in groups, attempting to swarm their countermeasures with lots of expendable, cheap munitions. An example of an interstellar patrol craft would be the Lewis and Clark, a search and rescue vessel operated by the United States Aerospace Command and made famous by its investigation of the Event Horizon. However, as with most ships we'll talk about today, patrol craft is a rather broad classification, and can include vessels that might be designated fast attack craft, torpedo boats, or missile boats. These can be outfitted with faster engines to accommodate high-speed interdiction, an increased armament through which many smaller patrol craft could more effectively overwhelm larger warships, or even be designed with a small hangar meant to accommodate a shuttle or starfighter. Some of these vessels could be large enough that they might be considered the next largest ship type, corvettes. A corvette is traditionally the smallest class of vessel considered to be a proper or rated warship as determined by the Royal Navy during the Age of Sail. They are fast, maneuverable, and easily produced, but unlike the smaller patrol craft, are generally equipped to operate further from friendly ports. Their main duty is protecting convoys, although specific variants can again be designed for mine-sweeping, mine-laying, anti-aircraft, or anti-ship duties. Multi-role corvettes, which incorporate all these applications, are increasingly popular here on Earth, and you'd expect across alternate worlds as well. The Polaris class, operated by the United Empire of Earth, would be a good example of an interstellar multi-role corvette. It's fast, versatile, and suited to both military operations, orbital security patrols, and search and rescue. The Raider class, used by the Galactic Empire and later the First Order, is another good example. This class, in particular, was outfitted for anti-starfighter duties and at times assigned as the sole dedicated transport to Special Forces units. I do have to question that latter usage, however. A warship the size of a corvette with dozens, even hundreds of crew seems oversized and overpowered to allocate to a unit like Inferno Squad, which would be only half a dozen soldiers. It seems to me to be more efficient to centralize multiple Inferno Squad-sized units on a larger warship and have them deploy via shuttle. Which brings us to frigates. Now, this might be the most ill-defined ship type fielded within any navy. Ship classes designated as frigates have at times more closely resembled corvettes, destroyers, cruisers, or even battleships. There have been heavy frigates, super heavy frigates, armored frigates, guided missile frigates, anti-submarine frigates, air defense frigates, escort frigates, patrol frigates, stealth frigates, first-class frigates, second-class frigates, and probably at least one laundry frigate. Basically, whatever you need to achieve with your navy, somebody has built a ship to do it and then called it a frigate. And you might forgive them for that. Frigates are generally the most widespread ship type in any navy, and for good reason. They're large enough to be able to perform a wide variety of roles, yet not so large that upgrading them to specialize in a specific area is prohibitively expensive. They're typically easier and less expensive to build and maintain, and don't require an excessively large crew to operate. They can be deployed independently, in groups, or serve as effective escorts for larger ships. In my estimation, frigates are the best bang for your buck. On their own, a multi-role frigate can accomplish pretty much anything you could reasonably expect, although maybe not as effectively or quickly as a purpose-built design. In a fleet, however, frigates are best used as escort ships. They would be deployed in a wide perimeter around the larger and more expensive capital ships, intercepting enemy fighters or munitions before they can hit a target that might be harder to replace. In a major conflict, you might not want to be assigned to a frigate if you have the option. No admiral of any worth would ever describe a ship as expendable, at least not publicly, but if faced with the choice of losing a frigate or an aircraft carrier, or a frigate and a transport ship loaded with material, the choice is pretty clear. The Stalwart class, in service with the UNSC, is a good example of an interstellar frigate, serving primarily as a fleet escort, but also capable of acting independently. I do take issue with its secondary use as a troop transport though, but we'll be addressing that a little later on. The Nebulon B escort frigates, used primarily by the Rebel Alliance, are another good example, but their role within the Alliance fleet was slightly problematic. At least one Nebulon B within the Rebellion was described as a medical frigate, and there's some issues here too. While I previously stated that frigates could be used in almost any capacity, a dedicated hospital ship is a bit of an exception. In our world, there are extremely specific restrictions under international law related to hospital ships. They need to be clearly marked, not be used for any military purpose, and not interfere with enemy combatants. Whether or not the Galactic Empire and Rebel Alliance have their own version of the Hague Convention, arming a hospital ship with guns and then flying it into an enemy's fleet is a bad look. That's an easy propaganda victory for the Empire if they can prove the rebels were taking cover behind the sick and wounded. Next in line are destroyers. The difference in both size and use between frigates and destroyers is increasingly blurred, and some navies don't make the distinction at all. In theory, destroyers are simply a more capable frigate, with greater armament, protection, speed, and endurance. While originally intended as specialized vessels, they've mostly evolved into multi-purpose warships. They're also the largest warships you're likely to see in service outside of major naval powers. The Algos class, in service with the Galante Federation, would be an appropriate example of a destroyer, distinct enough from smaller frigates used by the Federation's navy, yet not rivaling the size or capabilities of larger cruisers. The same cannot be said of the Omega-class destroyer used by the Earth Alliance. By our current definitions, the Omega-class resembles more so a battleship than a destroyer, and was even designed to replace one, so its designation is questionable. Were it not for the presence of cruisers and larger ship types in the Earth Alliance fleet, I would have guessed that the definition of destroyer had expanded, or it had come to encompass a wider variety of designs, but there is no such easy explanation. So now we arrive at cruisers. It should not surprise you that cruisers too have been built to serve in a variety of roles, but at their basic level, most are designed to balance speed, protection, and firepower. Specialized variants exist across different classes and navies, but often include air defense, surface bombardment, and anti-ship roles. They were initially intended to operate in distant territories, participate in commerce raiding, or scouting for the main battle fleet. Modern designs are more of a jack of all trades. Where modern cruisers differ from smaller ship types is that they are usually the smallest type of ship to include some sort of flag facility suitable for an admiral and his staff. This allows a cruiser to serve as a flagship for a flotilla, or even replace a larger carrier as the center of a battle group. The Galaxy class, while perhaps not technically designated a cruiser by Starfleet, is nevertheless a great example of an interstellar cruiser. Their blend of speed, firepower, and protection makes them suitable for long-range exploration missions during peacetime, while during major conflicts they can transition into command ships, and were deployed in immensely powerful Galaxy wings during the Dominion War. Hopefully they evacuated all the civilians on board before then. The UNSC's Marathon class would be an example of a more traditional cruiser. The ship is mostly balanced in its characteristics, and sometimes formed the center of smaller battle groups, while larger fleets would include entire Marathon groups. Now, as we move past cruisers, things get a bit tricky. In our own world, cruisers tend to represent the largest warships outside of aircraft carriers, with everything larger and more powerful, rendered obsolete by changing tactics and technology. However, there have been times in naval history where larger ships have been useful and necessary, and who can promise that in an interstellar capacity, these types of ships might not be needed once more. Straddling the line between cruisers and larger battleships, we have the aptly named Battlecruiser. While cruisers were a balance of speed, protection, and firepower, a battlecruiser emphasizes speed and firepower at the cost of protection. The theory behind these warships was that they would chase down any ship with an inferior armament and outrun anything that outgunned them. Battlecruisers are glass cannons, not really meant to take a hit, but rather dish them out and then escape quickly when necessary. Yet, the battlecruisers in service in interstellar settings don't often reflect this. The battlecruiser used by the Higaran Empire isn't one of the fastest ships in the fleet, but rather one of the slowest, meant to brawl with other capital ships instead of chasing down weaker targets. The Resurgence-class Star Destroyer used by the First Order has also been designated a battlecruiser, but doesn't appear to operate like one. Ironically, the First Order's pursuit of the Resistance is the exact situation that battlecruisers were designed for, hunting down slower, older cruisers, and yet these ships were unable to close the gap. And I think the misappropriation of the battlecruiser name has a lot to do with the stigma related to the next ship type on our list, the battleship. On our own world, battleships were the queens of the sea, slow-moving but immensely armored and with unrivaled firepower. They were to be the deciding factor in any major fleet action and a major asset in surface bombardment. Ultimately, however, as air power advanced and other technologies changed the nature of naval warfare, battleships were rendered obsolete. Even when upgraded with better engines that gave them the speed previously reserved for battlecruisers, without the sacrifices to armor, these fast battleships were no longer cost-effective. I think the designation of battleship has become so associated with antiquated and obsolete technologies that nobody wants to call their new modern ship a battleship, even if it has all the qualities of one, like the Resurgence or the Hagaran battlecruiser. The Imperium of Man doesn't care though. The Retribution class is the quintessential battleship design. Slow, cumbersome, but absolutely enormous, with overwhelming firepower based around plenty of heavy guns. The Retribution is something of an outlier though. Instead, many interstellar navies seem to have invented or adopted new terms to describe their super heavy warships. Dreadnought is the most popular of these, but I'm not entirely sure if that makes sense. The namesake of this ship type was the HMS Dreadnought, a battleship with a revolutionary design that made all others obsolete overnight. Every battleship was thereafter known as either a pre-Dreadnought or post-Dreadnought, until eventually every battleship in service shared the characteristics of the Dreadnought, and there was no longer any point in distinguishing them. So does it make sense for the Executor-class superstar destroyers of the Galactic Empire to be officially designated as Star Dreadnoughts? Well, the term doesn't fit perfectly, but that's true of any ship type, so I don't really have a problem with it. I'm not sure how the Galactic Empire came to be influenced by the Royal Navy, but that's a question for another time. It makes a bit more sense when the Systems Alliance has ships called Dreadnoughts, though. While their role within the Alliance Navy is remarkably similar to that of a battleship or even battlecruiser, I can understand not wanting to have those terms associated with it. Unlike the Empire, the Alliance does exist in a universe where the HMS Dreadnought influenced ship names and design. So, moving on from the battleship and the battleship by any other name, we come to the ship type that made them obsolete, the carrier. On Earth, these are the largest warships ever to have been built and are typically designed to fulfill a single role, that of a sea-going airbase. A modern fleet carrier is not meant to attack enemy ships directly or even be fired upon. Rather, it is the armament of its aircraft that forms its striking power, and this has become so devastating over the decades that the role of most ships in any fleet will just be to protect the carrier. In an interstellar navy, you would expect carriers to be used the same way. They would carry a host of starfighters, but generally not be found in the thick of the fighting. But building a ship for an interstellar navy isn't quite the same as building a ship for a maritime one, and it allows for some interesting innovations. The concept of a battleship aircraft carrier hybrid, or battle carrier, has been around for a long time, but never really gained much traction. When you take all the ship infrastructure needed to support batteries of heavy guns, and all the ammunition needed to keep them firing, and then combine that with all the infrastructure needed to host an air wing, hangar decks, jet fuel, a flight deck, you'd probably end up with a giant mess. A battleship that can't take a hit, and an aircraft carrier that can't launch fighters very efficiently. In space, though, a few of these problems have solutions. The first is that you can make your warship as big as you want, with as much armor as you can slap on without worrying if the thing is going to sink. And depending on the technology used by the Navy operating it, you might not even need a full flight deck. Your TIE Fighter, Star Fury, F-302 or whatever doesn't need to worry about achieving enough lift to make it into the air. It can just hover and take off. Which brings up a whole host of possibilities. By their traditional maritime definitions, of all the ship types I've talked about, only the aircraft carrier can host a dedicated air wing. But with advanced technology, might come the opportunity to add air wings to battleships, cruisers, or maybe even frigates and destroyers, without impacting their primary role. It could be that having a squadron or two on board a warship becomes as ubiquitous as making a ship out of metal instead of wood, to the point where you don't even need a special designation for it. I don't see any reason why, aside from the additional cost, an interstellar fleet couldn't have almost every warship carrying varying amounts of starfighters, and then maybe a few dedicated traditional fleet carriers. The Galactic Empire seems to at least partially agree with me. Imperial Star Destroyers carry heavy turbolaser batteries alongside wings of TIE fighters. Same with the Battlestars used by the United Colonies of Kobol. Even smaller ships within those two navies, and many others, have demonstrated the ability to carry starfighters, so the concept of a battle carrier hybrid seems to have gained more traction there. Even on our own world, we're beginning to see these types of hybrid warships enter active service. Assault ships are a combination of aircraft carrier and troop ship. While they can usually only deploy helicopters or VTOL aircraft and can't carry as many troops, tanks, and supplies as a dedicated transport, they can be especially effective during amphibious landings and a great part of a rapid reaction force. Additionally, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union followed a different type of naval doctrine entirely, which we'll discuss in detail later on. But rather than building dedicated fleet carriers like the United States, it built our world's equivalent of a Star Destroyer, or what they termed a heavy aircraft carrying missile cruiser. Not only could it carry fixed-wing aircraft, but it also had 12 long-range anti-ship missiles. Okay, so if the idea of putting a bunch of starfighters on every ship type might make a bit of sense, and carrier troop ship hybrids exist in our own world, would it make sense to then stick a Marine brigade or company on every interstellar warship, just in case you need them? A destroyer, for example, that could jump into an enemy star system, shoot at some ships, and then land its troops. Well, I don't think this is a great idea. Adding fighters to a battleship or cruiser or frigate or whatever might make sense because regardless of ship type, those fighters supplement its capabilities. But infantry and tanks don't. In space combat, they're not useful at all and just going to be sitting around. Let's look at the Pillar of Autumn. When it crashed on Installation 4, it was loaded up with a ton of Marines and tanks and all-terrain vehicles, and those came in really handy. In that instance, it was beneficial, but the Pillar of Autumn was a light cruiser. If it had been performing the role for which it had been designed, all those tanks and troops would have just been a burden. It was only a minor miracle that they were able to land on the ring at all. On ships meant to engage other ships or conduct long-range patrols, I don't think it makes sense for the UNSC to include a Marine brigade or whatever in the hopes that when they're shot down, they'll miraculously land on a planet intact and be able to keep fighting the Covenant there. What might make sense instead is to include a giant hangar or cargo facilities on warships that are able to carry Marine or Army units when necessary. They're only used during operations that would involve a planetary assault or during emergencies. And for all I know, the Marine units on board the Autumn were not a permanent garrison, but maybe just being ferried off-reach. In that case, it all makes sense. But the best solution in my mind is something like the Acclimator class. This is a troop ship first and foremost. It has enough guns to not leave it totally defenseless, but it's not pretending to be a cruiser or a battleship. But some navies ignore this idea and put everything imaginable into one giant ship. These have no real point of comparison in maritime history here on Earth. They are sometimes called Titans, Juggernauts, Colossus, but the general idea is that it's just a really big ship. They can't be built in large numbers, but will always be the flagship of even the largest battle group, and sometimes even a type of mobile capital. I'm not sure I understand the point of these. While certainly capable of destroying any other ship in the galaxy, the idea of concentrating so much firepower in a single ship seems inefficient. No matter how powerful the ship, it can still only be in one place at a time, which is really more useful. A single First Order Mega class with, 150,000 turbolasers, or 100 Resurgence class with 1,500 turbolasers each. And with crew complements running into the millions, what they've really built here isn't so much a warship as it is a mobile city. Unless it's somehow entirely self-sufficient, you probably wouldn't even need to destroy it. Just intercept all the food, supplies, and whatever else it needs to operate. The idea might make sense if these super ships were used as a kind of mobile fleet base and headquarters, intended to support the rest of the fleet. But in that case, you wouldn't want it anywhere near combat, and it wouldn't need such overwhelming firepower. So with that, we've covered the basic ship types you're likely to see in any interstellar navy, but we've barely scratched the surface of what's out there and what's possible. There are still all the various transports and auxiliary ships, hospital ships, depot ships, replenishment ships, ammunition ships, amenity ships, which were just loaded up with movie theaters and beer, and I haven't even touched on submarines and what their counterpart in space might look like. But before I move on, there's one last type of ship I think could make a lot of sense in any interstellar navy, the arsenal ship. The idea behind an arsenal ship is really simple. It doesn't need to go very fast or have a lot of armor. Its only job is to carry as many missiles or whatever as possible. It might not even need a crew, instead being controlled remotely by an accompanying cruiser or even some kind of AWACS aircraft or spacecraft. In my mind, this is the perfect counter to the giant Juggernauts so loved by the First Order and others. When the Mega-class supremacy shows up, it's not met by an enemy fleet intending to duke it out, but just a few drone ships each packing a few thousand proton torpedoes. For an organization like the Resistance or Rebel Alliance that can't afford to fight a giant war of attrition, this seems like a great solution. Hopefully I've made the point that ship types can be nebulous and vague, and the differences between them can be subtle at times or even non-existent. What's interesting to me though is in the way that politics can sometimes interfere with how ship types are designated. For example, let's say your country lost a major conflict, and as a result of that, forever renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation. Instead, it agreed to maintain only a small and limited self-defense force. It would be hard to argue that its navy would be allowed to have an aircraft carrier, for example. But what if the years go by, the international situation starts to look a little different, and you decide you really want an aircraft carrier? Well, the solution is simple. Build one, but don't call it that. If anyone complains, all you have to say is, well, that's not an aircraft carrier. You can clearly see it as a helicopter destroyer. Completely different. Or what if a foreign power controls an especially important navigational route that your country really wants to use? And what if they've imposed some kind of convention on the use of that route? Say, prohibiting the transit of warships larger than a certain size, and locked it off to aircraft carriers altogether. Well, the solution is simple. Throw a few cruise missiles onto your aircraft carrier, and if anyone complains, all you have to say is, well, that's not an aircraft carrier. You can clearly see it as an aircraft carrying cruiser. Completely different. I find the politics surrounding how ships are designated to be really interesting, and yet I can't find many examples of this in interstellar navies. One I did find, however, was in the rearmament of the New Republic. When their navy began building warships comparable in size, power, and role to the Star Destroyers used by the Galactic Empire, many in the New Republic were understandably concerned. And the Navy solution was actually pretty great. All they had to say is, well, that's not a Star Destroyer. You can clearly see it as a Star Defender. Completely different. I love those kinds of details, so if you're aware of any others, please let me know. Okay, but even though I've just spent the last half hour talking about how ship types are kinda nebulous and politics can interfere with them, that shouldn't give interstellar navies license to call ships anything they want. If some navy built a battleship and called it a Corvette, there should be a really good reason as to why. Likewise, navies need to avoid the temptation to just throw on a bunch of verbs or adjectives to make things sound cooler. On our world, as discussed, the word assault typically indicates an aircraft carrier geared towards amphibious landings. Yet I feel like some interstellar navies that shall remain nameless have taken this as evidence that you can just throw the word assault on any ship to make it sound like it's better at attacking stuff. The same goes for terms like strategic, tactical, support, advanced, and command. Any navy with an advanced, ultra-heavy, tactical assault dreadnought has gone too far. Okay, but enough about ship types. Let's talk about how they're organized and what doctrines they can follow. Now, the purpose of naval doctrines is to enhance the operational effectiveness of naval forces. It guides the actions of naval branches in supporting national objectives. Depending on those national objectives, those doctrines can vary wildly. The national objectives of the United States and its naval policy seem the most applicable to interstellar warfare. The American Navy's main purpose is that of power projection. It can operate huge fleets basically anywhere in the world. The most powerful of its task forces are known as carrier battle groups. These fleets are centered around one or more aircraft carriers, and then escorted by cruisers, destroyers, frigates, submarines, etc. The primary offensive element is not necessarily the ships themselves, but rather the air wing stationed aboard the carrier. This should sound somewhat familiar, as it's also how most interstellar navies seem to be organized and operate. There is a core group of capital ships hosting hundreds if not thousands of fighters, escorted by smaller support vessels. They screen the capital ships from fire, allowing the fighters to do most of the offensive action. And this makes nothing but sense. If your nation is spread across various planets and star systems, having a navy with the ability to project power across that territory is a necessity. The American doctrine of power projection and fleets organized around carrier groups, in my opinion, should be the default, standard organizational structure of most interstellar navies. But there are other options, and some might make more sense for specific organizations. The main counterpoint to American power projection during the Cold War was the Soviet doctrine of aerial denial. Unlike the United States, the Soviet Union was largely self-sufficient. During wartime, it wouldn't need to protect trade convoys at the same scale as NATO, nor would it need to ship tens of millions of troops and all the associated supplies and equipment across an ocean. Their major targets were just a tank ride away. Because of this, enormous fleets of warships projecting power across the globe weren't a huge priority for the Soviet Navy. That's not to say they totally abandoned the idea. Soviet carrier groups did exist and were deployed to ports across the world, but there was very little chance they would pose a credible threat to their American counterparts during wartime. Instead, Soviet naval strategy and doctrine was centered around a primarily defensive force. Its ships and aircraft wouldn't engage enemy fleets in direct face-to-face attacks, but rather lure them into range of friendly ground-based airfields and bases. American carriers could then be attacked by swarms of cruise missiles launched from warships, ground silos, and aircraft launched from both Soviet carriers and Soviet air bases. So could this work in an interstellar setting? I think so. Imagine a nation that exists only in a single star system or planet, or maybe in a really well-centralized cluster of star systems. If it didn't intend to project power somewhere far across the universe, only operating a smaller collection of ships supported by surface installations could make a ton of sense. It's mentioned that the Systems Alliance Navy rarely engages in battles situated in open space, because either side can almost always just retreat. In that case, if a nation can't compete with the Alliance Navy directly, I think adopting that Soviet style of interstellar warfare is a great solution. The final doctrine, distinct enough from the American and Soviet approaches, is probably that used by the Kriegsmarine in World War II. Unable to compete directly with the British, French, or American navies, the Germans instead found the most success in using groups of submarines organized into wolf packs to target enemy supply convoys. While the Kriegsmarine did operate larger surface warships, these were more often than not a drain on the overall war effort and not of any major consideration to the Allies. Ironically enough, the Rebel Alliance could learn a lot from the Kriegsmarine. Capital ships really have no place in the rebellion. They are expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and expensive to keep fully crewed. The rebellion is far too limited in both manpower and resources to justify putting so much of both into a giant target. When the Galactic Empire is capable of always fielding greater numbers and greater firepower, being able to hit your targets and get the hell out is much more important than the associated prestige of operating a capital ship. The Romulans might also take a few notes from the Kriegsmarine. A cloaked ship is essentially the U-boat of space. Why engage the Dominion or Federation directly when you can fire some photon torpedoes and then literally disappear? As we near the end of this mammoth look at interstellar navies, we finally reach the most important part. What do you name your ships? I am a sucker for a clearly defined naming convention. Not every navy uses them, but why wouldn't you? And as with most things, a lot more thought goes into what to name a warship than you might think. So let's start with the Americans. Their naming conventions have changed a bit over time, and like everything, there's plenty of exceptions, but traditionally it goes something like this. Aircraft carriers are named for historical events, mainly battles, or increasingly for US presidents. Battleships are named for US states, cruisers are named for American cities, and destroyers and frigates are named for Navy and Marine Corps heroes. Next, the Imperial Russian Navy. They had no carriers, but battleships were named after Russian royalty, saints, generals, and battles. Cruisers were named for mythical figures, admirals, or gemstones. Destroyers were named after adjectives like valiant, and frigates were named after birds or animals. Now, the Imperial Russian Navy makes for a great example because you can see how these conventions changed when the Soviets took over. The new regime was a bit more eclectic with their naming over their history, but it ended up looking something like this. Aircraft carriers were named after cities, battleships and battlecruisers named after revolutionary heroes, cruisers were named after generals, admirals, or cities, destroyers were named after adjectives, and frigates named for animals and weather phenomena. Now on to the modern Japanese self-defense forces. Helicopter destroyers are named for traditional provinces and mountains. Destroyers are named for mountains and weather terms like hurricane, and frigates named for rivers. There's a lot more great examples of this from our own world, but it's unfortunately very difficult to find naming conventions used in interstellar navies. Most ships used in the Imperial Navy of the Galactic Empire and the United Federation of Planets Starfleet seem to follow no protocol whatsoever. But there are a couple of great examples. The UNSC fleet is first. Its fleet carriers are named for provinces on Earth. Its light carriers for predatory aquatic animals. Battleships are named for historical wartime leaders. Cruisers are named after adjectives. Destroyers are named after famous aircraft and mythical warriors. Frigates are named after lines from famous poems or songs, and typically limited to just 3 words. Another great example comes from the Systems Alliance Navy. Here, dreadnoughts are named for mountains, cruisers named for cities, frigates named for battles, and carriers named for famous scientists. I don't think there's any wrong way to do this, but as with everything, sometimes politics gets in the way. There have been stories that ships have been named for people or ideas favored by the current government administration and maybe showing a little bias. There's also been a few cases where naval ships have been named for people in a different branch. You can imagine the Navy feeling a bit pissed off if their new carrier was named after an army general, for example. Or for people who were very vocal in their dislike of the Navy. You have to wonder what Albert Einstein, a lifelong pacifist, would feel about a fleet carrier being named for him by the Systems Alliance. Sometimes ships are named before they've even been built or approved as a way to shore up support. I don't know if any examples of this exist within interstellar navies, but I get the sense it might be easier in the Galactic Empire to win support for your new ship class if you name it after Palpatine or somebody important. But that's where I differ from the Galactic Empire. I differ in other ways, but they're not really relevant to this conversation. In my opinion, capital ships, aircraft carriers, and the most prestigious warships in the fleet shouldn't be named for people. I think it's almost an act of vanity to name something that requires the skill of thousands of sailors to operate after a single person. But that's really my only thought on the subject. Aside from that, anything goes. Oh, except never name a ship after something that might be seen as a challenge to the sea or space. That's bad luck. Ship naming conventions might seem less important in the grand scheme of things, and I won't argue against that. But pride in one's ship and fleet can be an important part in maintaining the morale of any navy. In 1988, on our own world, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, an American frigate, hit a mine in the Persian Gulf. In one of that ship's passageways was a plaque dedicated to the ship's namesake, a destroyer that fought bravely and was sunk during the Battle off Samar in 1944, that was itself named for Samuel Booker Roberts Jr., a US sailor killed a year earlier in the Guadalcanal campaign. It is said that in 1988, even as sailors raced to save their vessel, any who went by that plaque would touch it to honor the memory and legacy of their ship. A ship's name should give embittered crews that level of inspiration. So I hope that covers the basics on how to build your interstellar navy. If you are an up-and-coming despot looking to take over a slice of the galaxy, or an established Lord of the Admiralty brushing up on the basics, I hope you found this at least somewhat useful. And if you did, name a ship after me. One of the smaller ones, though. And even though I am this generation's Alfred Thayer Mahan, and all my opinions and explanations are flawless, and certain to influence interstellar naval doctrine for the next few centuries, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Is there a type of ship you think might transition to use in an interstellar navy differently from how I described it? Should the Rebel Alliance have embraced capital ships simply because they look cool? Did anyone actually make it this far in the video? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, this has been Incoming. In Incoming, the Templin Institute discusses the theories and ideas found across alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.